The wind howled outside Berkner Station as the helicopter's rotors faded into the endless gray sky above. It wasn't the usual whirring sound of the chopper's blades that had taken over the air. It was the silence that followed, a cold, unyielding quiet that could only exist in a place so far removed from everything, from civilization, from time, from life itself. For all its desolation, this silence felt alive. It was as if the world beyond the station had ceased to exist, leaving only this small, insulated bubble of warmth and metal at the edge of the earth. Jack Foster stood at the edge of the station's metal platform, his hands deep in his pockets, trying to ignore the biting cold that gnawed at his bones. His eyes scanned the horizon where nothing but ice and snow stretched endlessly in all directions, as far as the eye could see. The recruits had arrived. He could tell they were nervous, their faces pale and drawn as they surveyed the desolate landscape before them. The helicopter, their last connection to the outside world, had already disappeared, its black speck swallowed by the nothingness that hung heavy in the sky. Jack glanced at them, his new recruits. Emily, the quiet one who looked like she could snap at any moment. Lucas, the restless, eager young man who probably thought he could handle anything this place threw at him. And Sarah, the skeptical one, eyes narrowed in distrust as if she could smell something off in the air. All of them looked lost in this wasteland. "All right," Jack said, pulling his jacket tighter around him, feeling the icy wind biting through the layers. "Welcome to the edge of nowhere. This is Berkner Station. For the next 4 months, I'm the only thing standing between you and becoming a popsicle with a name tag." His voice, gruff and worn from years in this place, echoed across the frozen expanse. He studied their faces carefully. The fear was palpable, though none of them spoke it. They weren't ready, but they would be, they had to be. "Jack Foster," he continued, a smirk playing at the corner of his lips. "I've been here longer than I care to remember. If you follow the rules, you'll make it. If you don't..." He let the silence hang between them, heavy with meaning. "Well, let's just say I don't have a contingency plan for the ones who screw up." They shifted nervously, their eyes darting between each other. He could see the questions forming behind their eyes. What kind of place was this? What exactly did they sign up for? Jack didn't give them much time to wonder. He started walking toward the main building, a sturdy, no-nonsense structure made of cold steel and concrete, built to withstand the most unforgiving conditions. The recruits fell into step behind him, the sound of their boots crunching in the snow the only noise breaking the stillness. As they reached the entrance, Jack punched in the security code. It was an odd one, 4 digits, simple enough to remember, but something about it made him uneasy. The door slid open with a mechanical hiss, and a blast of hot air greeted them, momentarily making it feel as though they had entered another world. The warmth hit like an oven after the cold had frozen their lungs, and for a brief moment, the recruits looked almost relieved. Jack led them into the common room, a sparse, functional space with mismatched couches, a kitchenette that always seemed to smell faintly of burnt coffee, and windows that revealed the same white nothingness outside. The air inside smelled faintly of oil and dust, like it had been closed off from the world for too long. "Take a seat anywhere," Jack said, as he closed the door behind them. He motioned toward the worn-out furniture. "We've got some ground rules to cover before the real fun starts." The recruits moved to their respective spots. Emily took the seat closest to the northern door, her eyes glued to it, as if she were waiting for something to happen. Lucas slumped onto the couch, already tapping his boots impatiently on the floor. Sarah pulled out a notebook and settled into the corner chair, already scribbling something down. Jack couldn't help but notice the difference in their reactions. Each of them was processing their new reality in their own way. "All right," Jack began, letting his voice take on a more serious tone. "Let's go over the rules. The rules are simple. They're not negotiable." Berkner Station operates on 6 basic rules. Follow them and you'll survive until the next supply drop in April. Break them and you won't. He paused, letting the words hang in the air, watching their faces. They were listening now, the tension thickening in the room. Rule 1, no one goes outside after dark. Period. He locked eyes with each of them. It doesn't matter if you think you hear something, or if you think you've seen something out there. Stay inside. If you break this rule, you're not coming back. Understand. A small chuckle escaped Lucas, who scoffed. What, like there are polar bears out there or something? I thought we were in Antarctica. Jack's face remained expressionless, but his voice turned cold. Polar bears are the least of your problems. Out there, the only thing you need to worry about is the dark, the cold, and what's waiting in it. Rule 2. If you hear voices calling your name, especially from the northern side of the building, you ignore them. Completely. Jack's eyes scanned the recruits, lingering on Sarah, who had already begun scribbling in her notebook. Doesn't matter who it sounds like, doesn't matter how convincing it is, you ignore it, no questions, no exceptions. Lucas leaned forward, his skepticism evident. You're telling me that if we hear someone calling for help, we just leave them out there? That's messed up. Jack's voice lowered, barely a whisper. If you listen, if you follow the sound, you'll be out there with them. That's how it works. That's how they get you. His words sent a chill through the room, and for a moment, even the cold air from outside seemed to shrink back. Rule 3. If you see people in blue maintenance uniforms anywhere around the station, you acknowledge them politely, but you do not engage in conversation. They do their job, you do yours. You don't ask questions, and you certainly don't get in their way. The recruits exchanged uncertain glances. Emily was the first to speak up. Maintenance crew, how many of them are there? 3, Jack said without hesitation. Sometimes 4 if there's heavy work, but they don't talk, they don't make small talk. You don't try to be friendly, you don't engage, you just let them do their job. Jack saw Emily flinch, her gaze fixed on the door once again. It was strange, but the way she reacted made him pause for a moment. It wasn't normal, her intensity, but he didn't push it. There were bigger things at play here. Rule 4, the radio is for emergencies only, real emergencies. Not for calling home because you miss your girlfriend or your mom. We have a system in place here. It's simple. Use it wisely or not at all. Emily raised her hand. How do we define an emergency? Jack's eyes met hers, his expression unreadable. Anything that poses immediate danger to station personnel. Fire, structural failure, medical disaster. Anything else can wait. You use your judgment, but use it carefully. The room was quiet for a moment before Lucas broke the silence with a snide comment. So basically, we're stuck here with no way to get out unless it's life or death. Jack didn't flinch. That's exactly it. Rule 5, you maintain regular sleep schedules and meal times. This is not a suggestion. This is a must. The sun will go down in an hour, and it will stay down for the next 4 months. People get disoriented. People get depressed. If you don't maintain a schedule, you will fall apart. Trust me, I've seen it happen. Jack saw them all nodding, the weight of this rule sinking in. The darkness wasn't just outside, it was inside, too. The isolation would grind them down piece by piece if they didn't keep a routine. Rule 6. If anything seems wrong, and I mean anything, you come to me. You don't try to solve it yourself. You don't try to handle it. You don't know what this place can do to you. You just come to me, immediately. Jack paused, looking at each recruit. If you break these rules, I won't come looking for you. You'll be on your own. The recruits were silent now, fully absorbed in his words. They had been dropped off at the edge of the world, and the true nature of that world was only beginning to dawn on them. Jack let the silence stretch for a moment before he spoke again, his voice quieter. This place has a way of making you forget the rules. Don't forget them, trust me. The next few months will test you in ways you don't understand yet. The recruits glanced at each other again, but there was no turning back now. The doors had closed behind them, and all they could do was move forward. Jack turned toward the door, his eyes scanning the icy expanse once more. "All right, let's get to work. We've got a long winter ahead of us." As the days dragged on in the bleak, icy landscape of Berkner Station, the sun barely rose above the horizon before sinking back into the endless darkness. The cold was omnipresent, seeping into every crack of the building, every corner of their souls. The recruits had quickly learned that survival here wasn't just about physical endurance, but mental fortitude as well. The rules Jack had laid out were now a constant presence in their minds, whether they were working or trying to sleep. For the first few days, the recruits kept to themselves, trying to adjust to the harsh rhythm of life at the edge of the world. But as time wore on, something began to change. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly, and Jack, despite his years of experience, couldn't quite put his finger on it. The temperature seemed to drop even further as the days went on, and the wind howled with a disturbing regularity that rattled the windows and shook the very walls of the station. The sounds at night were the first signs of something wrong. It started with what the recruits thought were creaks in the building, the natural noises of an old structure settling in the cold. But then, the creaks turned into whispers, low, indistinguishable murmurs, as though someone was speaking just outside their doors. Emily, the most reserved of the group, was the first to mention it. She had been staring at the ceiling in her bunk for hours, unable to sleep, when she heard a faint voice, too clear to be the wind, too specific to be dismissed. She described it as a hushed whisper calling her name. "Emily?" The voice was soft, almost loving, but there was an edge to it. She had waited for a while, hoping it was a figment of her imagination, but the voice came again, clearer this time. "Emily, please." At first, she tried to convince herself it was the wind howling through the vents or perhaps a trick of her own tired mind. But as the days passed, the whispers grew more distinct, coming from different parts of the building, sometimes sounding like it was directly outside her door. On the fourth night, she couldn't take it anymore. She had heard her name again, unmistakably this time, echoing in the hallway. She got up, half awake, and shuffled toward the northern door. She wasn't sure why, but she felt an irresistible pull towards it, a sense of urgency she couldn't explain. She stood by the door for a long moment, listening, feeling the chill creep up her spine as she stared into the pitch-black darkness beyond the glass. There was no sound, no movement, just the endless, oppressive silence of the snowstorm outside. She had just begun to pull away from the door, the cold air biting at her face, when she heard it again, clearer than before. "Emily, come outside. We need you." Her heart skipped a beat. She didn't recognize the voice, but it felt strangely familiar. Comforting. Before she could stop herself, Emily had entered the code for the door. She pushed it open, stepping into the howling wind. Jack had warned them about the dangers of going outside after dark. The rules were clear. The moment Emily stepped outside, she should have felt the cold gnawing at her, the danger pressing in on her from every angle, but instead she felt compelled, drawn towards something she couldn't explain. Back inside, the other recruits were already asleep, the sounds of their breathing filling the common room. They hadn't heard the door open. When Jack awoke the next morning, he was met with an unsettling silence. Emily was missing. Her bed was untouched, her notebook left open with her last entry half finished. She had been keeping detailed notes of her experiences, perhaps more out of habit than anything, but her last words seemed to be something about hearing the voices clearer tonight. Jack's first instinct was to dismiss it. She had probably gone for a walk in the storm, trying to clear her head. It was something they all had done before. He went to check the security feeds, but the cameras outside the station were all static, frozen as if they too had been overcome by the frigid temperature. He didn't like that. The cameras were designed to handle the harshest conditions, but now they were all dead. His heart began to race as the minutes ticked by. No one went outside after dark. No one but Emily. When the recruits woke up and found out Emily was gone, the panic was subtle, but it was there. Lucas, ever the skeptic, tried to laugh it off. She's probably off somewhere, lost in the snowstorm, trying to get a glimpse of the northern lights or some nonsense. But Sarah was different. She had been quiet, her sharp eyes ever watchful, but now she spoke up. "I heard her. Last night, I heard her voice." Jack's eyes narrowed. He knew what she was implying, but he didn't want to admit it. He brushed her off, though a part of him felt the creeping tension in his gut. "You're tired," Jack said in a low, almost casual tone. "It's just the isolation. Trust me, I've been here longer than any of you. After a while, the brain starts to play tricks on you. Emily probably went to get some air or just needed to think." But as the hours passed, the discomfort among the recruits grew. Their daily routines were interrupted by small but disorienting events: equipment malfunctioning at odd times, strange noises coming from the maintenance rooms, and cold spots in places that should have been warm. It wasn't just the isolation anymore. Something was changing. Then came the maintenance crew. They arrived a day later than scheduled, which was odd considering their work was supposed to be timely and consistent. They were a team of 3 men, each wearing the standard blue maintenance uniforms that Jack had warned the recruits about. But these men were different. They didn't speak. They didn't ask for introductions, and they didn't acknowledge the recruits beyond a polite nod when they entered the common room. Their movements were calculated, precise, as though they had done this countless times before, without need for communication. It was as if they already knew the layout of the station better than the recruits. Every action they took felt rehearsed, devoid of personal expression. Jack had known these men for years. They never spoke much. They didn't need to. They came, they fixed things, and they left. But there was something about them now that felt off. The air seemed to grow heavier around them, and it wasn't just because of the oppressive cold. When they finished their tasks, they left just as quietly as they had arrived. But the strange feeling lingered long after they were gone. No one mentioned it at first, but the recruits began to notice their eyes, their distant gaze. The odd, unsettling silence that followed their every movement. It wasn't long before the first cracks began to appear in Jack's explanations. The strange occurrences continued. The temperature dropped even further, and whispers began to echo through the hallways. The recruits could no longer ignore the sense of dread that had settled over the station like a heavy fog. No one could sleep. No one could escape the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Then it happened. Lucas, the first to brush off the strange events, began acting differently. He started to spend more time by himself, walking around the station late at night, his eyes darting nervously at the shadows. One night, after a loud crash came from one of the storage rooms, Lucas disappeared. He wasn't in his bunk. His boots weren't by the door. His coat was gone. At first, the recruits didn't say anything. But by the time Jack realized Lucas was missing, the sun was already sinking below the horizon. The silence that followed was deafening. Jack's gut twisted. Something was wrong. He'd been here long enough to know when the station was pushing back. The rules were designed to keep them safe from the outside world, but what if the threat wasn't out there? What if it was already inside? As Jack stepped into the common room, he saw the recruits standing around, their faces pale, eyes wide with fear. They were all beginning to question him now, his explanations, his calm demeanor. They didn't believe him anymore. "Where is Lucas?" Sarah asked, her voice shaky. Jack exhaled slowly, trying to suppress the rising sense of dread in his chest. "He's out there somewhere. Probably went for a walk. I'll go look for him once the storm calms down." But even as he said it, he knew. He wasn't looking for Lucas anymore. The entity was already here in the station, playing its game. And now, Jack had no choice but to play along. "It's not safe," Jack had said, his voice thick with years of experience, the kind of experience that came from living alone in a place where the world seemed to forget your existence. Don't go outside after dark. The cold will kill you in minutes, and the night— He paused, his eyes glancing toward the windows as though something beyond them was trying to push its way inside. The night does strange things to people out here. It gets in your head. But despite Jack's warning, the strange light Lucas had been watching for the past few nights beckoned him. It was always at the same time, after the storm had raged long enough to convince everyone that nothing could be worse than this isolation. He had tried to ignore it, rationalized it as a figment of the restless mind, but there was something about it that felt too real, too alive. The faint, glowing lights, pulsating in the distance, were just beyond the station's perimeter, seemingly at the edge of the world. No one had said anything about them, but Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that someone was waiting for him out there. As the days passed and the darkness deepened, the strange phenomena— the voices, the whispers— began to claw at the back of his mind. That night, with the wind howling against the walls and the endless polar twilight pressing in from every side, Lucas stood by the door. His hand hovered over the keypad for a long moment before he input the code. The door slid open with a low whine, and a blast of icy air greeted him like an old enemy. The darkness outside felt cold, oppressive, thick with anticipation, but Lucas, driven by something deeper than logic, stepped into the storm. The cold bit at his exposed skin like 1,000 needles, but it wasn't the cold that made his heart race. It was the feeling that the world had become impossibly silent. The wind, usually deafening, was strangely muted, and in the distance, the lights were closer now. The pulsing lights like something calling to him, pulling him forward. He walked, stumbling through the thick snow, trying to keep his bearings. The farther he went, the more the world seemed to fade. The lights beckoned, growing brighter, more distinct. His breath came out in sharp clouds, and his feet sank deeper into the snow with every step. He shouldn't be out here. Jack's words echoed in his head, but the pull of the lights was stronger than any caution. Back at the station, the others had noticed his absence only minutes after the door had shut. Sarah was the first to speak up, her voice shaky, filled with concern. "Where's Lucas?" she asked, her eyes darting to the now-closed door. Jack had been too distracted with the sudden static on the radio to notice at first, but when he saw the recruits starting to look at each other with uneasy expressions, he realized Lucas had broken one of the most important rules. He went outside. Jack muttered under his breath, "Damn it!" He rubbed his face with both hands. He had warned them, he had explained the dangers, but Lucas was different. The young recruit was restless, curious, perhaps too curious for his own good. Jack grabbed his jacket and immediately headed for the door. He had to find Lucas. If the boy had wandered off too far, there was no telling how long it would take to find him, or if they would find him at all. Lucas's journey took longer than expected. When he finally reached the source of the lights, they were not what he had anticipated. They were no simple lamps or lights reflecting from another station, no benign flares of the endless night. The lights were dancing now, almost alive, like flickering shadows of something just out of reach. The air around them felt wrong, charged with an energy that made his heart race faster than the cold air in his lungs. He tried to approach the source, but the closer he got, the more unsettled he felt. His mind screamed at him to turn back, but his legs refused. The lights, now much closer than he had realized, began to flicker in patterns, odd, geometric shapes that didn't belong in nature. Before he knew it, he was standing just yards away from what seemed like a frozen mound of rock beneath the snow, a large object hidden under a blanket of frost. The lights circled it, teasing him, as if waiting for him to understand. His heart pounded in his chest as his breath came faster. Then, something in the snow shifted, something large and dark, barely visible, but unmistakably there. Lucas didn't have time to think. He turned and ran, the overwhelming sensation of being followed sending a surge of adrenaline through his body. The wind was back now, roaring in his ears as he ran blindly, not daring to look back at the lights or the shadow he could feel lurking behind him. He reached the station door in what felt like an eternity, his lungs burning, his legs trembling from the cold and the terror. His hands were frozen as he tried to punch in the security code, but the door didn't open. It wouldn't open. When Lucas returned to the station, it was clear something had gone horribly wrong. His eyes were wide, pupils dilated with fear, his face pale from the exposure and the sheer terror that had followed him. His clothes were torn, his boots caked with snow, but his lips were sealed. Not a word. Jack met him in the common room, his face stern, expecting an explanation, but Lucas said nothing. He stood there, shaking, his body still tense, his eyes darting around the room as if he expected the lights to follow him inside. Jack's voice was low, sharp as he approached. "What happened? What did you see out there?" Lucas opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. His hands twitched and he took a step back, suddenly too close to the edge. He collapsed into the nearest chair, eyes wide but still silent. Jack pressed again, this time with more urgency. "Lucas, talk to me. What did you see?" But the recruit only shook his head, his eyes glazing over as if whatever he had witnessed was too much for his mind to handle. The room grew quiet. The others, Emily and Sarah, watched in stunned silence. They had heard the whispers in the walls, had felt the air grow heavy with something they couldn't explain, but seeing Lucas like this, utterly broken, made it real. They were not just hearing things. They weren't imagining the strange sounds or the flickering lights. Something was out there. The tension grew over the next few days. Paranoia crept into the station like a slow, creeping frost. Every creak of the walls, every whisper of wind, every flicker of the lights brought them closer to unraveling. Jack did his best to maintain his calm, but even he couldn't shake the growing unease that hung over them. The sense that they were being watched, that something was out there, something unnatural, gnawed at them all. Lucas became more distant, his behavior erratic. He kept looking over his shoulder, as though expecting someone to be standing just behind him. The whispers, too, began to return, and this time they seemed to be calling their names, one by one. Sarah started to voice her suspicions, but no one wanted to listen. She had seen the way Lucas flinched when someone mentioned the lights, the way his hands shook, his lips quivering as if he were remembering something too painful to say. It was clear to her that Jack wasn't telling them everything. She started to believe that whatever was happening in Berkner Station, Jack knew more than he was letting on. The other recruits began to feel the same. They started noticing discrepancies in the logs, things Jack had missed, or more likely, things he had intentionally ignored. The power failures were becoming more frequent. The maintenance crew's visits had become longer and more methodical, almost as if they had their own agenda. And now, the whispers were growing louder, almost like they were in the walls. The paranoia reached its peak when the flickering lights returned, and this time they weren't outside. They were inside, dancing across the walls as though taunting them. Everyone was on edge, every little sound setting off a new wave of anxiety. Jack, for the first time since he had arrived at Berkner Station, felt the cold dread. He had spent years here, but even he couldn't ignore the undeniable truth that something was lurking in the shadows. As the days wore on, Jack found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about Berkner Station. Could it be the isolation? Could it be the extreme conditions playing tricks on their minds? Or was something far worse happening, something he had been trying to deny for years? Whatever it was no longer something that could be ignored. The entity, the one that had been whispering in their minds and pulling them toward the darkness outside, was getting closer. And now, no one could pretend that they were safe anymore. The strange behavior of the maintenance crew had become impossible to ignore. Ever since their arrival, the team of 3 men, who always moved in eerie synchrony, had drawn the recruits' suspicion. The crew was silent, their eyes vacant, and their movements too precise, as if they had a singular purpose that was neither for the station nor for the people in it. And yet, they had been here for years, with seemingly no interest in socializing or sharing anything about themselves. They arrived, completed their tasks, and left without a word, their presence felt but never truly acknowledged. For days, Sarah, Lucas, and Emily had exchanged looks, wondering what was going on. Jack, of course, remained as calm and indifferent as ever, but the recruits weren't so sure. There was something off about the maintenance crew, something they couldn't place. And with the growing tension at the station, the whispers, the lights, and Lucas's breakdown, it seemed like the crew's odd behavior was becoming more than just a quirk. It was a clue, a sign that something more insidious was happening at Berkner. That night, while Jack was in his room working on his logs, Sarah and Emily decided to investigate the maintenance crew further. They knew the crew's schedule by now. They worked quietly during the day, checked the backup generators, inspected the equipment, and repaired whatever was broken. But their work never seemed to stop, even when there was no actual need for repairs. Emily was the first to notice the logbooks left in the maintenance room. She had been looking for a missing part and stumbled across a dusty shelf with several binders. The pages inside were filled with scribbles, but something stood out. The crew's work records were strangely incomplete. The logs listed only basic tasks: generator check, pipe inspection, equipment maintenance, but there were large gaps between dates. Some months were completely blank, while others had only a few lines scrawled in barely legible handwriting. Sarah leaned over Emily's shoulder, her brows furrowing. "Why are there so many gaps? It's like they're trying to hide something." Emily flipped through more pages. There's no mention of anything out of the ordinary. No failures, no reports of incidents. Nothing that explains why we're here in the first place. She stopped at a page that was almost entirely blank except for a few cryptic words scrawled in the margins. "Deeper than we thought. It's waking up." What does that mean? Emily muttered under her breath, her fingers shaking as she turned the page. The next page was even more unsettling, a long list of names with dates next to them, some marked transferred while others were crossed out with bold black lines. "What is this?" Emily whispered, her voice tight with suspicion. "These names, some of them, they are the missing people." Sarah didn't answer right away. She was staring at the names, her mind racing. There were too many for it to be a coincidence, and now the missing personnel weren't just coincidences, they were part of a pattern. This wasn't just a research station, this was something much darker. They were trying to cover it up. The next day, the recruits tried to shake off their suspicions, but the thought of the strange logs gnawed at their minds. They didn't talk about it, but they began noticing the odd behavior of the maintenance crew even more. They always seemed to arrive at the exact same time each day, no matter the weather. They never showed emotion, never interacted with the recruits except for the bare minimum required. Their eyes, empty, cold, seemed to be focused on something far beyond the station, something none of the recruits could see. Then, one afternoon, Jack walked into the common room with a frown, his eyes scanning the recruits, who were silently watching the maintenance crew work. He looked out the window, where the crew was in the distance, adjusting the satellite dish on the roof. Jack hesitated, then muttered something under his breath. "I'm going to go check on something," he said abruptly, then walked out of the room. After he left, Sarah, Emily, and Lucas exchanged glances. They knew it was time. They quietly left the common room and crept through the hallways, eventually finding a small storage closet where they could hear the faint sounds of the crew talking. They huddled by the door, straining to hear the conversation. "I think it's getting worse," a voice said, low and cautious. Another voice replied, "We don't have much time, they're too close. We have to make sure the next batch goes according to plan." "Are we sure this is the right team?" the first voice asked. "Yes," the second voice responded. "This one is perfect. They're close enough to believe they're in control, but not smart enough to stop us." Sarah's blood ran cold. She glanced at Emily, who was equally stunned. The maintenance crew weren't here to repair anything. They were here to replace the recruits, to take over their identities. "They've done it before," the second voice continued. "This station is too important for us to fail. We can't afford any more mistakes. We need to accelerate the schedule. If the crew doesn't respond, we'll need to act faster." There was a moment of silence, then the first voice whispered, "Understood." The conversation ended abruptly as footsteps neared, and Sarah, Emily, and Lucas scrambled to hide. They barely managed to duck into an alcove as two of the maintenance crew walked past, completely oblivious. That evening, Jack pulled the recruits together for an impromptu briefing. His demeanor was different, tense, like he was holding something back. When they were all gathered in the common room, he finally spoke. "You've been asking questions," Jack said, his voice cold and distant. "And I know what you've discovered." The recruits exchanged uneasy glances. They hadn't expected him to address it so directly. "You want to know about the maintenance crew?" Jack continued, his eyes scanning the room. "You've noticed their behavior, the blank logs, the disappearing personnel, the strange conversations you've overheard." Jack paused, letting the silence stretch. He seemed to be searching for the right words. Finally, he spoke again, but this time there was no humor in his voice. "They're not human," he said quietly, his eyes flashing with a hidden intensity. "What?" Lucas said, incredulous. "What do you mean they're not human?" Jack's face hardened. "They are replacements, constructs created by something below the ice. They were brought here for a reason, and their purpose is to replace us, to blend in." The recruits sat in stunned silence as Jack's words sank in. The world they had thought they knew, the rules they had followed, were all starting to unravel. Later that evening, as the recruits tried to process the truth about the maintenance crew, something even stranger happened. Sarah was standing near the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape when she caught a glimpse of something moving outside. At first, it looked like one of the maintenance crew, but then Sarah saw something that made her stomach lurch. A shadow, long and contorted, moving in a way that didn't make sense. It wasn't human. The figure was too tall, its movements jerky, almost mechanical, as though it was learning how to walk. It stepped closer to the window, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she made out a faint glow coming from its eyes. It turned, and for a split second she saw its face, a face that wasn't human. It was a distorted, shadowy version of one of the recruits' faces. Sarah stumbled back from the window, heart pounding in her chest. "Jack," she whispered, her voice trembling, "you need to see this." Jack appeared almost instantly. He hadn't expected this. He looked out the window, and for a moment he too felt a wave of disbelief wash over him. The figure had vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only the quiet, endless snow outside. "I told you," Jack said, his voice a low growl. "The entity, it mimics, it learns, it takes everything. The people here, the ones that went missing, they're not gone, not really. They're still here, inside that thing." The mysterious voice outside Berkner Station had become an obsession for Sarah. It wasn't just the lights she had seen or the strange patterns in the snow. Those were easy to dismiss as tricks of the isolation or her own imagination. But the voice was different. It had a presence, a compelling pull that she couldn't ignore. It began softly, at first, just a whisper on the wind, something she could easily brush off as a trick of the mind. But as the days wore on, the voice grew clearer, more distinct, until it was unmistakable. "Sarah?" It was soft, yet undeniably real. She had tried to convince herself it was nothing. Just the isolation, the pressure, the strange atmosphere of the station getting to her. But as the night grew colder and the storm outside intensified, she could no longer ignore it. The voice felt too familiar, too much like the calls she had heard from her mother when she was younger. Something about it felt like home, and yet it was wrong. That night, Sarah sat at the small table in the common room, her eyes locked on the window. The wind howled outside, shaking the walls, but all she could hear was the voice calling her name. It wasn't loud, but it wasn't faint either. It was directed at her, reaching into her mind like a soft breeze caressing her skin. "Sarah," the voice beckoned. The others were asleep, scattered around the room, their breathing steady and deep. But Sarah couldn't sleep. She couldn't block it out any longer. The room around her felt too warm. The world felt too safe inside the walls of Berkner Station. The voice had called her out there, beyond the walls, beyond the warmth. There was something waiting for her, something she had to see, something that would make sense of the madness she had been living through since the moment she arrived. She stood up, her heart pounding in her chest. Her hand hovered over the door handle as her mind raced with conflicting thoughts. Jack had warned them. He had told them never to go outside after dark. The rules were clear. But the voice wasn't asking. It was commanding, pulling her like a string. Without a second thought, Sarah typed in the code for the door. The harsh sound of the system unlocking sent a jolt of fear through her, but the voice was calling. She couldn't resist. She stepped out into the cold, feeling the icy bite of the wind against her skin. Outside, the world had transformed. The snow whipped around her, the darkness swallowing everything beyond the station. But in the distance, the lights, faint, pulsing, and alive, were still there just like they had been before. "Sarah!" It was almost too much to bear. The voice was so clear now, so direct, as though it was standing beside her, breathing with her. She moved forward, almost instinctively, following the call, her body leading her through the white landscape. The further she walked, the more she could feel the weight of the isolation pressing down on her. The storm raged above her, but it felt like it was coming from within the station, from the very walls that were supposed to protect her. There was something out here, in the snow, in the dark, that was waiting for her. She didn't know what it was, but she couldn't stop herself. Then, just as she reached the edge of the station, where the snow stretched out in every direction, she saw it. A shadow in the distance, moving with purpose, much like the shadows she had seen before. She stopped. The voice stopped too, as if waiting for her to catch up. And then there was nothing. No movement, no shadow, no sound. For a long moment, Sarah stood frozen, trying to comprehend what was happening. The cold crept deeper into her bones, but the fear didn't come from the temperature. It came from the silence that now surrounded her. Suddenly, the voice returned, louder now, more urgent. "Come closer." Sarah's feet moved before her mind could catch up. She was heading toward the darkness that had swallowed the shadow. As she stepped further into the snow, the world around her seemed to warp. The cold was biting, the wind howling, but something inside her was awake now, urging her forward. It wasn't until she felt the strange markings in the snow under her boots that she stopped. The footprints weren't hers, they weren't human. The ground was littered with strange symbols, arranged in patterns that made no sense to her. In a daze, Sarah crouched to inspect the symbols. Her breath caught in her throat as she recognized the shapes, symbols she had seen earlier, in the maintenance crew's logs, in the strange scribbles they had found, but never dared to question. Before she could process what she had just uncovered, a sudden darkness descended on her, suffocating and oppressive. The wind picked up again, howling in her ears, and the lights blinked once, twice before they snuffed out entirely. She didn't scream. She couldn't. Her feet were stuck in the snow, and before she could move, the world went black. Back at the station, hours passed before anyone noticed Sarah's absence. Emily was the first to speak up. "Where's Sarah?" she asked, her voice filled with unease. She turned toward Jack, who had been sitting in the common room, reading through some paperwork. Jack didn't answer immediately. He stood up slowly, looking out the window, his face hardening as he saw the absence of Sarah's footprints near the station's door. "She's gone," he said quietly, as though he had been expecting this. "What do you mean she's gone?" Lucas said, his voice rising in panic. "She can't just disappear." Jack didn't respond. Instead, he walked toward the door and stared out into the snow as if searching for something. The other recruits followed him, their eyes darting between the empty station and the vast, white wasteland outside. It was no longer just about Sarah's disappearance. The truth was setting in, and with it, the terrifying realization that the voice wasn't some hallucination. It wasn't a trick of the isolation. The voice had been the entity, calling them, pulling them, turning their own minds against them. That night, the recruits were shaken to the core. They sat together in the common room, no one saying a word. The weight of what had happened pressed on them like the thick, cold darkness outside the walls. The entity had reached out, and it wasn't done yet. The recruits couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread. Sarah had broken the rule, and now she was gone, lost in the snow, and yet they could feel her presence. The entity had taken her, just like it had taken the others before her. But this time, the recruits weren't just witnesses, they were targets. As the hours stretched on into the night, the tension in the room was palpable. Lucas paced in circles, his eyes wild. "We need to do something. We can't just sit here and wait for that thing to come for us next." Jack remained silent, his face unreadable. The recruits turned on him, their frustration turning to anger. They had trusted him, relied on him to keep them safe. But now, with Sarah gone, their faith in him was beginning to crumble. "Jack," Emily said, her voice sharp, "you knew something was wrong here. You've known it for months. You didn't tell us. You didn't warn us." Jack's gaze flickered toward Emily, but he didn't answer. The truth was, he had been trying to protect them, protect himself. But now it was too late. The entity was in control, and the recruits had become pawns in a game they couldn't even understand. The recruits no longer trusted Jack's explanations. They began to question everything. They had seen too much. They had felt the presence of the entity in their minds, in the snow, in the lights, and now they had lost one of their own. And as they huddled together in the cold common room, the realization hit them with a gut-wrenching force. The entity had been calling them all along. It knew their names, their fears, and now it was playing its final hand. The storm outside had not let up for days. The wind howled with the fury of 1,000 wild beasts, scraping against the metal walls of Berkner Station. Inside, the recruits huddled together, their breaths heavy in the cold air that filtered through the cracks in the old building. They were trapped, not just by the unforgiving wilderness outside, but by the terrifying force that had taken root in the station, the entity. Jack, who had once been their rock in this icy world, now seemed like a stranger. His usual calm demeanor had cracked, revealing the truth behind the years of silence and guarded secrets. The recruits sat in the common room, their eyes fixed on him as he prepared to reveal the truth that had been gnawing at their minds for days, weeks, since their arrival. Jack stood by the window, his back to them, staring into the swirling white void beyond the glass. The room was eerily silent as the recruits waited for him to speak. "It's time you know what we're really dealing with here." Jack's voice was low, thick with years of regret. He turned to face them, his eyes darkened with a burden that seemed too heavy for any one person to carry. "The entity, the thing beneath the ice, it's not just some random occurrence," Jack began, his voice steady but strained. "It's not a storm or a natural disaster. It's something far older, far more dangerous. It's a parasitic intelligence. It feeds on memories, on identities, and it doesn't just feed, it replaces." The words hit the recruits like a physical blow. Their minds scrambled to make sense of what Jack had just said. A parasitic intelligence? Feeding on memories? What are you talking about? Emily's voice cracked through the silence. She had been unusually quiet since Sarah's disappearance, but now she spoke with growing frustration. How could something like that even exist? Jack took a deep breath. He had been dreading this moment, the moment when he would finally admit the horror he had been trying to suppress for so long. It's been here for as long as anyone can remember. Jack's voice was laced with bitterness and regret. When they first built Berkner Station, they thought it was just a cold place, a harsh environment with little else to fear. But they were wrong. The entity is beneath the ice. It's been there for centuries, maybe longer. Jack stepped forward, his eyes locking onto each recruit in turn. It doesn't just consume your body. It consumes you, your memories, your thoughts, your very identity. It doesn't need to kill you outright. It just takes what you are and becomes you. Your body may be left behind, but it doesn't matter. The entity lives on in the copy it makes of you. The room was silent, the recruits trying to absorb the magnitude of what Jack had just said. It seemed impossible. But the pieces were beginning to fall into place. The disappearances, the strange behavior, the whispers in the walls, and now the voices that had been calling them. The air in the common room seemed to grow heavier as Jack continued, his words slow and deliberate. The entity mimics human behavior perfectly. It copies everything, your movements, your voice, your memories. It can make a copy so accurate you'll never know it's not real. Lucas leaned forward, his eyes wide with fear and disbelief. You mean to say that? Jack held up his hand, cutting him off. Yes, the people who have disappeared, they've been consumed by the entity. Their bodies are still here, but their identities are gone, replaced. You may have seen them around the station. You might have even talked to them, but they are not who you think they are. The recruits looked at each other, the weight of Jack's words sinking in. The maintenance crew, the ones who had been so oddly silent, were the first clues. They had always been too perfect, too well-practiced. They never spoke, never interacted with anyone. And now it became clear, they weren't just maintenance workers, they were copies too. The room fell into a deep, oppressive silence. Everyone was thinking the same thing. Who else had been replaced? Who else in the room was real? The next morning, as the recruits continued to process the shocking revelations, something even more disturbing happened. Emily, who had been absent for hours, finally returned. At first, they thought it was a relief. She was alive, but that didn't stop the uneasy feeling that gripped them as she walked back into the station. Emily had been missing for several hours, and though no one had dared to speak it aloud, everyone had assumed the worst. She had gone outside, broken the cardinal rule, and might have become another victim of the entity. But now, she was back. The moment Emily stepped into the common room, Jack's eyes immediately narrowed. There was something off about her. Her movements were stiff, as though she were walking through water. Her face was pale, and her eyes seemed to be locked onto something no one else could see. She didn't greet anyone. She didn't even look at them. She simply stared ahead, her expression vacant. "Emily?" Jack asked, his voice low but full of concern. Emily didn't respond. Instead, she walked over to one of the chairs, sat down, and folded her hands in her lap, her gaze never leaving the wall. Sarah, who had been silently watching the scene unfold, couldn't help herself. "Emily, are you okay?" There was no response at first. Then, almost imperceptibly, Emily turned her head to look at Sarah. Her smile was strange, too wide, too forced. It wasn't her smile. "I'm fine," Emily said, but the words felt hollow, robotic. Something inside Sarah recoiled. This wasn't Emily. The group exchanged uneasy glances. Something was terribly wrong, but they couldn't place it. Emily was there, but she wasn't. And yet her appearance was perfect, her face, her voice, her mannerisms. But the feeling, the unsettling chill that had settled over them told a different story. The recruits spent the next few hours in silence, trying to make sense of everything Jack had revealed. But as they did, a creeping suspicion began to form in the back of their minds. Emily was back, but she wasn't Emily. Her behavior grew more and more erratic as the hours passed. At one point, she wandered into the kitchen, picked up a coffee mug and held it in her hands for minutes, staring at it as if she had forgotten what it was for. When someone asked if she wanted food, she simply said, "I'm not hungry," with a flat tone that made the words sound wrong. It was as if she were replaying a role, like she was trying to remember how to act, but the pieces weren't quite fitting together. The recruits couldn't take it anymore. They started to question everything. Were any of them even who they said they were? Was Jack even Jack? The fear in the room escalated as the unsettling truth began to sink in. The next night, as the recruits were gathered in the common room, Jack did his best to reassure them. "We're not completely helpless. The entity can mimic, but it's not perfect. There are ways to tell, there are subtle differences." But the doubts lingered. Could they trust anyone? Could they trust themselves? The tension among the recruits reached a breaking point. The entity wasn't just some abstract fear. It was real, and it was inside the station, inside them, wearing their faces, mimicking their voices, their memories. And there was no way to know who was human anymore. The mimicry had begun. The snowstorm outside had intensified, making it feel like the station was being slowly swallowed by the wilderness. The relentless wind howled against the walls of Berkner Station, and the sky had faded into an eerie twilight that seemed to stretch forever. Inside, the recruits gathered in the common room, their faces drawn and weary from the days of fear and tension. The recent events, Sarah's disappearance, the revelation of the entity, and Emily's unsettling return had left them all shaken. But there was still something missing, something that hung in the air, unspoken but palpable. Julie felt it more than anyone else. The voice had been calling to her too, but it was different from the others. She hadn't heard it like Sarah or seen the lights as Emily had. But she had felt something familiar, something personal. That night, as the recruits sat in the common room, Julie remained unusually quiet. Her eyes kept flickering to the door, as though waiting for something or someone to enter. She had been reflecting on everything Jack had said about the entity. It mimicked, it fed on memories, it took on identities. But there was one thing Julie couldn't shake, her brother Daniel. The silence in the room seemed to press in on her, and finally, Julie could no longer hold it in. She stood up suddenly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor, drawing the attention of the others. "I need to tell you something." Julie's voice was firm, but there was a tremor to it. She glanced around the room, meeting the eyes of the recruits who had become like family in these isolating months. But this was something personal, something that had been eating away at her ever since she arrived at the station. Jack looked up from his seat. His face was tired, but there was an understanding in his eyes. He had seen it before, this feeling of needing to tell the truth, even if it didn't make sense. Julie took a deep breath, steadying herself. "My brother Daniel, he worked here at Berkner Station, years ago." The room went silent again. Sarah, Lucas, and Emily exchanged confused glances. Jack's expression shifted, a flicker of recognition passing through his eyes. "Daniel was stationed here about 2 years before I came. He went missing. The official report said he was transferred to a research facility in Colorado, but that's a lie. I've been digging, and there's no record of him ever going there. I think," Julie hesitated, her voice trembling with the weight of what she was about to say. "I think he was taken by the entity." As Julie spoke, the words felt heavy on her tongue. Her heart raced, but she couldn't stop herself from unraveling the truth. Daniel had always been special to her, her older brother, the one who had always looked out for her. The idea that he could have vanished, taken by something she couldn't even understand, felt like a knife in her chest. "I never believed it at first. I thought maybe he'd just left, that he was tired of the isolation, the loneliness," she continued, her voice cracking. "But I've been here long enough to know that there's something wrong. And now I'm starting to wonder if Daniel didn't just disappear. What if he was taken? What if he's still here, just like all the others?" Her words hung in the air, and the recruits fell silent. They could feel the weight of her confession. They had all felt the creeping suspicion that something was off, but this was something else entirely. If Daniel had been taken, then it meant the entity had been operating far longer than they had imagined. But then, something strange began to happen. That night, after Julie had spoken, visions started to haunt her. At first, it was just a fleeting image, a shadow at the edge of her vision, standing in the hallway, just beyond the reach of the station's dim lights. But the shadow was always familiar, always his. Daniel. Julie dismissed it at first, convinced that it was the isolation playing tricks on her mind. The snowstorms, the silence, it was easy to believe that her mind was starting to fray. But the visions didn't stop. They became clearer with each passing day. She began to see him everywhere, in the kitchen, by the window, in the shadows between rooms. At times, she would catch a glimpse of him in the corner of her eye, his eyes bright, his expression full of urgency. "Julie, help me," he would whisper, his voice barely audible over the howl of the storm. The visions felt so real, so alive, and yet when she tried to speak to him, he would vanish, leaving nothing but the silence of the station in his wake. Julie became increasingly obsessed with the visions of Daniel. Every time she thought she saw him, she would follow the trail, running to the windows, looking for him in the hallways, desperate for any sign that he was really there. But each time, she found nothing. Jack noticed her growing fixation, and one evening, as Julie stared at the shadows once again, Jack approached her. "Julie, you have to stop," Jack said, his voice tight with concern. "This place is playing tricks on you. It's the entity trying to manipulate you, trying to use your emotions, your memories. It's not Daniel. It can mimic, but it's not him. It can't be." Julie turned toward him, her face pale, her eyes wide with confusion and desperation. "But it feels like him, Jack. I know it's him. I can feel him. He's trying to reach me. He's trying to tell me something. He's trying to warn me about the station." Jack took a step forward, lowering his voice. "I don't want you to fall into the trap. You think you're communicating with your brother, but that's exactly what it wants. The entity feeds on emotions, on your memories, your connections. It mimics. It learns." Julie's hands trembled, and she took a step back, feeling a mix of fear and anger bubbling inside her. She didn't know who to trust anymore. Her brother had always been there for her, and now, to think that she might be losing him to something that wasn't even human, it was too much. In the midst of her confusion, Julie found something that might give her the answers she was desperately searching for. One morning, as she was rummaging through an old box in the station's storage room, she found an old leather-bound journal. It was worn and faded, the pages crinkled from age and use. The journal had a name written on it, Daniel Brady. Her heart skipped a beat. Daniel's journal. Julie didn't hesitate. She grabbed it, her hands shaking, and opened the first page. The handwriting was unmistakably his, full of detail, of stories and observations about life at Berkner Station. But as she read further, her stomach churned. The entries grew darker, more paranoid. Daniel had written about the strange occurrences he had witnessed, people going missing, strange lights in the distance, and most importantly, the entity. In the journal, Daniel described something he had seen one night, a figure in the snow, just beyond the station's reach, moving with a purpose. He wrote about the cold feeling he had when it approached, how he couldn't look away, how he felt compelled to follow it. The journal detailed the slow descent of the staff at the station, how the entity had begun to replace people, to take their identities. Daniel had written about the dark truth of Berkner Station, that it was not a research station at all, but a trap, a place to feed the entity, to provide it with fresh memories, fresh identities. He had even written about how he began to suspect that his own disappearance would be orchestrated, a part of the entity's plan to continue its reign. The last entry in the journal was the most chilling of all. It was a simple note, written in a shaky hand. If you read this, don't trust anyone, not even me. The entity has learned to speak through us. It wants you. Stay away from the snow, stay away from the lights. Julie's hands trembled as she closed the journal. The truth was undeniable now. The entity had been manipulating them, and Daniel had been its first victim. Her brother had fallen prey to it, just like the others. But what if the entity had never let him go? What if Daniel was still out there, in the snow, in the darkness, trying to warn her? The walls of Berkner Station seemed to close in on them as the recruits gathered in the common room, their faces pale, their minds heavy with the knowledge they had uncovered. The truth was becoming unavoidable. The entity that lurked beneath the ice wasn't just a legend or a ghost story. It was real, and it had been hunting for as long as the station had been operational. Julie sat at the table, her eyes glued to the screen of her laptop, her fingers trembling as she scrolled through a seemingly endless list of files. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the computer's fan and the occasional rustling of paper as the recruits cross-referenced records. The air was thick with unease, with the knowledge that they were far from the first to suffer the entity's terrifying grip. It was as though the truth was lurking just out of reach, like the shadow of a figure waiting to be fully revealed. But they weren't prepared for what they would find. They had only just begun to scratch the surface. Julie's obsession with her brother's journal had led her to search for any sign, any trace of him. She was relentless, flipping through records, searching for inconsistencies, for any mention of her brother's name, Daniel Brady, in the station's archives. But it wasn't just about Daniel anymore. Julie felt an increasing urgency to uncover the hidden history of Berkner Station, to find out what had happened before they arrived. With Emily, Lucas, and Sarah helping her, they began cross-referencing the station's official records with the public databases they could access through the station's satellite connection. At first, it seemed like a futile exercise, just a bunch of routine maintenance reports, research logs, and personnel transfers. But then, something strange started to emerge. A pattern. Missing persons. The first name Julie found was Daniel Brady, her brother, listed as transferred to a research station in Colorado. But further investigation revealed no records of him ever being sent there and no mention of his death, just a gap in the timeline. This, Julie had already suspected. But as she scrolled further down the list, she found more names, dozens of names, each one linked to Berkner Station. There was Jonathan Miller, a research assistant, last seen leaving the station to retrieve supplies. No one ever heard from him again. Then there was Sarah Fletcher, a maintenance worker who was supposed to be on the last supply run to the mainland. She disappeared without a trace, and her records showed no follow-up. The pattern became undeniable. The names, the dates, and the disappearances all followed a consistent timeline, and each one was linked to the station's founding, as if something had been gradually consuming the personnel, erasing them, replacing them with something else. Julie slammed her hands onto the table, causing the others to jump. They were never just lost. She muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. They were taken. The recruit stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. It wasn't an accident. This wasn't the kind of place where people just disappeared. The entity had been at work long before they ever set foot in Berkner Station. Julie's discovery sent shockwaves through the recruits. They spent hours, days even, sifting through records, piecing together the horrifying timeline. The more they looked, the clearer it became. Berkner Station wasn't just a research facility. It was a trap, a containment zone designed to keep the entity locked away. The disappearances weren't random. They followed a pattern, a cycle of people arriving, going missing, and being replaced by perfect copies. There were no official reports of any of the personnel leaving or dying, just empty spaces in the records, as though they were erased from history. Julie felt the sickening weight of what she had uncovered. Her brother had been just another victim in this nightmare. And yet, he had documented everything. It was late one night when Julie stumbled upon a new entry in Daniel's journal. It was buried deep in the last few pages, as if he had written it in haste, perhaps just before he disappeared. She read it aloud, her voice shaking. "I've been watching it for days, trying to figure it out." Julie's voice wavered. "It has a name, not one we've been told, but one I think it would recognize. It's the thing beneath the ice. The thing that mimics us. It watches us, listens to us, learns us. It speaks in our voices. It takes our memories, our feelings, it becomes us." Her voice faltered as she read, but she continued. "I think it's trying to replace everyone here. We are all part of its plan. I'm writing this down because I don't know how much longer I'll be me. It has already started. I can feel it. It's inside my head, inside my memories, and it's learning to be me. The longer I stay here, the harder it will be to remember who I am." Julie slammed the journal closed, her heart racing. The realization hit her like a blow to the chest. Daniel had known. He had known what was coming. The truth was unbearable. Berkner Station had never been about research. It wasn't even about maintaining a safe outpost in the wild. It was about keeping the entity contained and using the people who came through to feed it. They were just bait. Julie stared at the journal, her hands shaking. She understood now. The station was never meant to be a place of research. It was a prison, a containment zone for the entity. And her brother had been part of the trap. He had been taken, and now it was her turn. It was their turn. The following day, after hours of research and quiet reflection, Julie went to the station's kitchen. She needed to clear her head, to take a breath before the weight of the world around her crushed her completely. But when she entered the kitchen, she saw something that stopped her dead in her tracks. At the counter stood a figure, a man, familiar yet wrong. He was wearing the same clothes as her brother Daniel, his posture relaxed, his hands folded across his chest. His face was a perfect mirror of the man she had once loved. The same brown hair, the same green eyes that used to make her feel safe. But the longer she looked, the more the details began to feel off. He didn't greet her. He didn't look at her like he used to. He didn't smile. He just stood there, his body stiff, his eyes locked on something beyond her. It was him, but not. The look in his eyes wasn't Daniel's. It was empty, like the gaze of a mannequin, like it was waiting for something to tell it what to do. Julie's voice caught in her throat. "Daniel?" The figure blinked, and for a moment she thought maybe, just maybe, he had heard her. But then it spoke. "I'm Daniel." The voice was his, but it was flat, lifeless. "No, you're not." Julie took a step back, her heart racing. "You're not him, you're not my brother." The figure tilted its head as though considering her words. "I am Daniel, I am all that remains, the one you loved, the one you lost, the one who will never leave you. We are the same now, Julie, we are the same. Join us, let me show you." ***, Julie felt her blood run cold. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the creature that wore her brother's face, and yet, in the pit of her stomach, she knew it wasn't him. It couldn't be. Daniel was gone. Julie stepped backward, shaking her head, but the entity's words held her captive, pulling her closer. Its eyes, the ones that had once been her brother's, seemed to pierce her very soul. And then, without warning, the creature vanished. 1 second it was there, standing before her, and the next it was gone, leaving only the cold emptiness of the station to remind her of what had just happened. Julie's hands trembled as she clutched the counter, struggling to keep herself from collapsing. She wasn't sure what she had seen, but one thing was certain now: the entity wasn't just mimicking them, it was taking everything. The walls of Berkner Station had never felt so cold. The relentless snowstorm outside pressed against the station like a living thing, its howls seeming to echo through the very foundation. The darkness beyond the walls was unyielding, stretching on for eternity. Inside, however, the darkness felt just as suffocating. It was not the isolation or the harsh winds that gnawed at the recruits' minds anymore. It was the creeping, overwhelming presence of the entity. The night was falling, as it always did in the polar winter, but this time there was no relief to be found in the darkness. They were trapped. The entity had become their reality. The strange mimicries, the stolen identities, the paranoia, it had all led to this. The recruits were now forced to face the truth. If they didn't find a way to escape, they would become part of the entity's growing collection. The recruits sat in the dimly lit common room, their faces drawn and tired, their bodies stiff from the cold and the strain of the past few days. They were gathered around the table, with Julie, Emily, Lucas, and Jack at the center. The room was filled with the quiet hum of the station's old generators, but the silence between them was far more deafening. "We're running out of time." Julie's voice broke through the heavy silence. She was looking at the others, but her eyes were focused on something far beyond the walls of the station. "We have to make a choice. We can either stay here and wait for it to take us, or we can try to escape." The recruits had spent days trying to find a way out, searching for any weakness in the station's design, any escape routes that had been overlooked. But the truth was, they had no options left. The storm outside would kill them in minutes if they ventured into the cold. And even if they somehow made it outside, there was no guarantee that they wouldn't end up being hunted by the entity. "I've been thinking about this," Jack said quietly, his voice hoarse but resolute. "We can't run, we have to confront it. The entity is here because of us, it feeds on us. If we don't face it, we're just going to end up part of the collection, just like everyone else who's disappeared." Emily looked at Jack, her eyes filled with doubt. "You really think we can fight it? It's not human. It doesn't follow the same rules. It mimics us. How can we stand a chance against something that knows us better than we know ourselves?" Jack didn't have an immediate answer. The truth was, no one had the answers anymore, but they were running out of time. "We don't have a choice," Jack said finally. "We can't keep hiding. We can't just let it take us. We need to take the fight to it." Julie's gaze hardened. "Then let's do it." As the recruits prepared for the final confrontation, the entity was already growing stronger. They could feel it in the air, in the strange atmosphere of the station. It wasn't just mimicking their movements anymore. It was copying their thoughts, their emotions. Julie had noticed it first. It had started with the visions of Daniel, visions that felt so real, so alive. But now it was happening to the others too. They started seeing things, hearing things. The entity wasn't just manipulating their senses anymore. It was becoming part of their very consciousness. The night before, Lucas had stumbled into the common room, his eyes wild. He had spoken in a voice that wasn't his own, repeating phrases that seemed to come from someone else entirely. I heard it," he had whispered. "It called my name just like it did to Sarah. I don't know what it wants, but it's not just outside anymore. It's in here. It knows who we are. It's getting stronger." And it was true. The recruits felt it too. The mimicry had become flawless. They were no longer sure who they could trust. Jack had tried to stay calm, but even he was starting to lose his composure. They had no idea who might be real anymore. And with the entity's power growing, there was no telling who would be taken next. With the stakes so high, the recruits realized that the only way they could possibly stand a chance was to break the cardinal rules, the very rules that had kept them alive up until now. The first and most important rule was never going outside after dark, but they were already too far gone to care about that rule anymore. Julie, Emily, and Lucas had been reluctant at first, but when they saw the state Jack was in, they knew they had no choice. The entity wasn't going to stop. It was only a matter of time before it consumed them all, and it wasn't going to be some quiet disappearance. The entity had learned to replicate them too well. "It's now or never," Julie said, her voice tight with the pressure of the decision. "We've been waiting for the right moment to make a move, but there is no more time." Jack nodded, though his face was grim. He knew what they were about to do was dangerous, but it was the only choice they had left. "We'll leave the station. We'll confront the entity head-on and we'll try to destroy it. The recruits made their way toward the northern door, the one that led to the wasteland beyond the station. As they walked, the reality of what they were doing began to set in. This wasn't just some planned escape. They were going into the storm. They were walking straight into the heart of the entity. The northern door groaned as it opened, and the freezing cold of the outside world hit them like a physical wall. The storm had already started to rage, the wind cutting through their clothes like knives, but they had no choice but to push forward. "Stay close," Jack ordered, his voice barely audible above the storm. "We stick together, no matter what." They moved forward into the blinding white expanse, the howling wind threatening to tear them apart. The snow blasted into their faces, sharp and unforgiving, but they pushed through it, moving toward what they knew was their only chance at survival. They didn't have to wait long. As they reached the edge of the station, the air seemed to shift. The temperature plummeted, and the wind felt like it was being sucked in toward something alive. They looked around, eyes scanning the horizon, but it was impossible to see through the storm. Then, from the swirling snow, a figure emerged. It wasn't just a person. It was a mimic, a perfect copy of one of the recruits. "Lucas," Julie gasped, her heart dropping into her stomach, but it wasn't him. It couldn't be. The figure didn't respond. It simply stood there, staring at them, its eyes empty, its expression frozen. But there was something about it that was wrong. The gait was off, the movements too mechanical. And then, without warning, the figure moved toward them. Julie froze, but Jack acted immediately. "Run," he shouted, his voice hoarse. They turned and sprinted toward the station, but the storm seemed to close in around them. The snow became blinding, and the wind seemed to scream, urging them to turn back, to give in. The mimic chased them, its movements growing faster, more confident, as though it had learned how to move. The recruits pushed on, adrenaline fueling their flight, but they knew that they weren't running toward safety. They were running toward the entity itself. Julie turned to look back, and for a split second, she saw another figure. This time Emily, standing still in the snow, her eyes vacant and empty. The figures multiplied, each one more familiar than the last, perfect copies, all moving toward them in eerie synchrony. The recruits were surrounded. And then, just as they reached the door, the last of their strength was gone. Julie, Emily, and Lucas had no choice but to face what they had been running from. The final confrontation had begun, but it was clear they weren't prepared for what the entity could do. The storm outside raged with a fury that only the Antarctic could produce. The wind howled, and the snow whipped against the walls of Berkner Station like the very fingers of death. Inside, the recruits huddled together, the weight of their situation sinking in. There was no escape. The entity had them trapped. Julie, Lucas, Emily, and Jack stood at the center of the common room, their faces drawn, their eyes haunted by what they had already seen and what they now knew was coming. They had tried everything: research, escape, confrontation, but the entity had only grown stronger. It had mimicked them all, broken their trust, and now it was time to face the truth. Jack's mind raced, his heart pounding as he tried to find a way out. But deep down, he knew the truth: there was no way out. The entity would never let them leave. It would always find them, always replace them. They were caught in a cycle, and they had just entered its final phase. The room was filled with a tense silence. The recruits couldn't look at each other without seeing the mimics lurking in the back of their minds. The storm outside had become a metaphor for what they faced: endless, relentless, and unforgiving. There was no safe place, no escape, no future. "We need to make a decision," Lucas said, his voice breaking the silence. He was pacing around the room, his eyes darting from face to face. "We're out of options." Julie stood up, her expression hardening. She had always been the strong one, the one who kept pushing, even when everything seemed lost. But now she could feel the weight of inevitability pressing down on her. There was no fight left in her. The entity had already taken too much. It had already won. We can't just keep running. Julie's voice was firm, but there was a defeated edge to it now. We have to make a stand. Jack's face was a mask of conflict. He had been the one to encourage the recruits to break the rules, to fight the entity, but now he knew that fight was futile. He knew that no matter what they did, the entity would always return. It had never truly left. But Jack couldn't let the others see his fear. They needed a leader, and for better or worse, he was still theirs. "We can't fight this forever," Jack finally said, his voice low, as if the weight of his words was too much for him to bear. "It's beyond us now. It's more than just some creature from the ice. This thing has a purpose, and we're just part of its plan. We can fight, but in the end, it will consume us." Emily looked up at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Then what? We just give up?" "No," Jack said quickly, his voice filled with urgency. "We fight, but we also need to trap it. If we don't, we'll end up like every other group that's come before us." It was Lucas who first spoke up, his voice steady in the midst of the storm's noise. "I'll do it." The room went silent. Everyone turned to Lucas, their faces full of confusion and fear. He was the youngest of the recruits, the one who had struggled the most with the isolation, the one who had always questioned Jack's authority. But now he stood before them resolute. "No," Julie said, shaking her head. "We can't let you. We have no choice." Lucas interrupted, his eyes burning with determination. "We can't keep running. We can't keep hiding. It's in here with us. If we don't trap it, it will just keep coming. I'm the only one who can do it. I've seen the maintenance rooms. I know the systems. I can use the self-destruct device hidden in the station's control room. We'll trap it here in the station, and the explosion will destroy everything." Jack stepped forward, placing a hand on Lucas's shoulder. "You don't have to do this, Lucas. We can still fight, we can." "No," Lucas said, his voice a whisper now. "I have to do this. It's the only way to stop it from spreading." Julie looked at him, her expression torn. She understood his resolve, but she didn't want to lose him. Not like this. "There's no time left," Lucas said, his voice shaking but firm. "If we don't act now, we won't have any chance of stopping it. I can trap it here. I'll set the device, and when it detonates, it will destroy the station and everything in it. It has to end." Without another word, Lucas turned and began heading toward the maintenance room. The recruit stood frozen, unsure if they should stop him or let him go. But they knew deep down that there was no stopping him. The station shook. A distant rumble that turned into a violent tremor, the sound of the self-destruct device coming to life. Jack's eyes darted from the walls to the door, his mind racing with fear. "It's done." Julie's chest tightened. She could feel the tremor reverberating through her bones. The storm outside had grown more violent than ever, the wind picking up as if it were reacting to the chaos unfolding inside. But then, the shaking stopped. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went out, plunging them into complete darkness. For a moment, everything was still. "Did it work?" Emily whispered, her voice filled with fear. Jack couldn't answer. He stood motionless, staring at the empty room that had once been their sanctuary. It felt wrong, the silence suffocating them. There was no explosion, no signs that the entity had been trapped. Instead, the room grew colder, the air pressing in around them. And then, from the darkness, they heard it, a voice, not their own voices, not any of their voices. The voice that had been calling them since they arrived, the entity's voice. "You cannot destroy me." The recruits recoiled, their hearts pounding in their chests. They could feel it deep within their bones. The entity wasn't gone. It had simply changed. It had learned. It had become stronger. "We won't stop. We can't stop." The voice echoed through the station, now deeper, more intimate. It was everywhere, inside their minds, inside their hearts. It had woven itself into the fabric of the station itself, like a parasite that had infiltrated their very beings. As the storm outside raged, the recruits stood still in the cold dark. They had failed. Their desperate attempt to escape had ended in failure, and now they were no better than the others who had come before them. Jack's mind swirled with guilt and anger. Lucas had sacrificed himself, and for what? To slow down the inevitable. The entity would always return. It would always come back. It had been feeding on their memories, their fears, their identities for years. It didn't matter what they did. It would always adapt, always evolve. They had lost. Berkner Station had become their grave, their prison. There was no escaping what was below the ice. No escaping what had already taken them. And as the storm outside raged louder, Jack's thoughts grew darker. Had they truly escaped? Or had they simply become part of the cycle? The entity had claimed them, just as it had claimed so many before. It would never stop, and neither would the storm. Jack stood, staring into the endless night, knowing that the entity would always return. It was a matter of time. Time was its ally, and it was only a matter of time before new recruits arrived to take their place. As Jack's body grew numb, his thoughts drifted to the endless night, the never-ending storm, and the truth they had all ignored. They were never meant to leave. They were never meant to survive. With a final, deep breath, Jack closed his eyes and waited for the inevitable. The storm outside had become something monstrous. It wasn't just the fierce winds that whipped the snow into a blinding maelstrom, nor the freezing temperatures that could strip the life from anyone who dared venture out. It was the sense of isolation, of being trapped in a world that had long since forgotten them. Berkner Station was no longer just a research outpost. It had become a prison, an endless cycle of fear, mimicry, and death. Inside, the survivors huddled together in the station's common room, the cold pressing in on them from all sides. Julie, Emily, and Jack were the last remaining recruits. They had lost Lucas, who had sacrificed himself in a desperate bid to trap the entity. But as they sat in the dimly lit room, their minds still reeling from the horrors they had witnessed, they knew the worst was yet to come. The entity was still here. It had not been destroyed. It had changed, evolved, and now it was hunting them in ways they couldn't understand. The self-destruct device that Lucas had activated had barely slowed it down. If anything, the entity seemed to feed on the chaos it had caused, growing stronger by the minute. Julie's hands trembled as she wiped the frost from the window, peering out into the white abyss beyond. Nothing. Just endless snow, spinning and whirling in the fierce wind. It was a dead world outside, a world that would consume them in seconds if they dared step into it. But the storm wasn't just a natural force anymore. It felt like a force of will, something that was deliberately keeping them locked inside. They had hoped to leave, to escape to a nearby research outpost, but the storm had grown so intense, it was as if the very elements had conspired to trap them here. "What's happening?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "It's worse than before. We can't leave." Julie glanced at her. She hadn't wanted to admit it, but the truth was undeniable. The storm was no longer just a physical barrier, it was a manifestation of the entity itself. The blizzards were unnatural, intensifying with each passing day, as if the entity was controlling them, wrapping them in a cocoon of cold, keeping them from escaping. "We're stuck." Jack's voice was low, his tone thick with the weight of reality. He stood in the corner of the room, staring at the flickering light above. The storm was getting worse, the wind howling like some beast that had trapped them in its jaws. "There's nothing we can do. We can't leave. The entity is controlling the storm. We're not just dealing with some creature from beneath the ice. It's learned to control the world around us." He turned to face the others, his eyes dark with dread. "We're running out of time." The storm outside continued its unrelenting fury, but inside, the tension between the survivors was growing as well. The entity had become more than just a threat. It was now manipulating their very reality. The mimicry had deepened, and they could no longer trust what they saw, what they heard, or even what they felt. Julie looked over at Emily, who was standing by the window, staring out into the void. She could see it too, the way Emily's eyes were unfocused, the way her hands trembled as if she were holding something back. She could feel it in her own chest as well, that weight of doubt pressing down on her, suffocating her. "Emily?" Julie asked softly, but her voice trembled. Emily didn't respond at first. Her eyes remained fixed on the snowstorm outside, as if she couldn't hear Julie's voice at all. Then, with a soft sigh, Emily turned toward her, her face pale and haunted. "I hear them," Emily whispered. "Voices, familiar voices." Julie's heart skipped a beat. The voices? Whose voices? She asked, her voice tight with fear. "I thought I heard my sister," Emily replied, her eyes wide. And my mother. They were calling my name. They were outside. I wanted to go to them." "No, Emily," Julie said, her voice low and urgent. "Don't listen to it. It's the entity. It's feeding off your memories, your fears. It wants you to follow it." But Emily didn't seem to hear her. She was staring out the window again, her face blank. "I need to go out there. I need to find them. They're waiting for me." Julie felt her stomach churn. Emily wasn't herself. She was already being taken, just like all the others. Julie rushed to her side, grabbing her by the arm. "Snap out of it," Julie shouted, shaking her. "They're not out there, it's a trap. It's the entity, Emily, it's manipulating you." Emily blinked as though coming out of a fog. Her eyes focused, and she looked at Julie, confusion in her expression. "Julie, what happened?" Julie's heart raced, but she knew she couldn't afford to lose time. "It's the entity. We need to stay together. We can't trust anything anymore. It's not your sister. It's the entity feeding off your memories. It's trying to take you." Emily shook her head, trying to make sense of it all. But deep down, she knew Julie was right. The entity had taken hold of her, had planted the visions in her mind, trying to make her follow it into the snow. Julie and Emily exchanged a look, both of them understanding the horror they were facing. But it wasn't just Emily who was being manipulated. The entity was inside all of them, lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike. As the days passed, the recruit's sense of reality began to break down. The entity's mimicry had grown stronger, more invasive. Julie started seeing things that weren't there, visions of people from her past, her mother, her brother, her childhood friends, all standing in the corners of the station, watching her. She tried to reach out to them, but when she turned, they were always gone. She was haunted by memories that weren't hers, haunted by images of people she had long since lost. They weren't real, they couldn't be real, but they felt real. And it wasn't just Julie. Emily had seen her sister again, Lucas had seen his father, and Jack had heard voices from his past, his lost comrades calling out to him. They were all being pulled in, each of them struggling to hold onto their sense of self. "I can't tell anymore, Julie," Emily said one night, her voice barely audible. "What's real? What's not real? Am I still me? Or is it all just a dream?" Julie didn't have an answer. How could she? The entity had made them question everything they knew. Who were they, really? Were they still the same people who had come to Berkner Station months ago? Or were they already part of the entity's collection, part of the mimicry, part of the endless cycle? It was clear to the survivors now that they couldn't stay in the station. The entity had grown too powerful, too close. They couldn't fight it with weapons, and they couldn't trust their own eyes. They needed to escape, but how? Julie, Jack, and Emily had been huddling together, trying to come up with a plan. They had one last hope, an old research vehicle stored in one of the outbuildings. It wasn't much, but it was their only chance. The vehicle could take them to the communication outpost miles away, where they might be able to send a distress signal and call for help. But the road to the outpost wasn't easy. The storm outside was brutal, and the entity had already shown its ability to manipulate the environment around them. The vehicle would never make it through the snow, the wind, the creature that was always lurking just beyond their vision, but they had no choice. Jack turned to Julie and Emily. "We go now. We leave the station, head for the outpost. We make it, we send the signal, and we pray someone gets to us in time." Julie hesitated. "But we're not sure what's out there. The entity might be waiting for us. It could follow us, it could." "I know," Jack interrupted, "but we have no time left. We're out of options." The recruits gathered what little they could, braving the cold and the storm to reach the vehicle. It was a long shot, a desperate attempt to escape, but it was all they had left. The survivors huddled together in the station's maintenance room, the faint hum of the generator providing the only sound in the otherwise silent facility. It was the kind of silence that weighed on you, a heavy, suffocating quietness that seemed to press in from all sides. Julie, Jack, and Emily were working together, preparing the old research vehicle that would take them on a perilous journey across the icy tundra. It was their last hope. The storm outside had only gotten worse, and their options were running out. They had to leave now or risk being trapped in the station forever. For the first time in days, the group allowed themselves a brief moment of hope. The vehicle was an old, rusty piece of equipment, but it was functional. They had repaired what they could, made adjustments to the fuel system, and prepared the emergency supplies. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. They had 2 days' worth of food, and if they could just make it to the nearby communication outpost, they might be able to send out a distress signal and call for help. "We can do this," Jack said, a rare smile tugging at his lips as he wiped his greasy hands on his jacket. "We've made it this far, right?" Julie looked at him, feeling the weight of his words. They were close, just a little more effort, and they might be out of the station, away from the entity that had been haunting them, away from Berkner Station, away from the thing beneath the ice. "We can do this," Emily echoed, her voice sounding stronger than it had in days. She clapped her hands together, trying to shake off the nervous tension that had built up over the course of the long hours they'd spent preparing. As they worked, there was a momentary flicker of hope. The vehicle was ready. The supplies were packed. The storm outside, while fierce, was manageable for the moment. It was easy to believe that they had a real chance at escape, that there was a way out. They had come so far, and though the journey ahead would be treacherous, it was possible. "It's almost time," Julie said, standing up straight, her fingers tingling with anticipation. "Let's get moving." But just as the group prepared to leave, the first signs of sabotage began to show themselves. Jack had been double-checking the fuel lines when he noticed something was wrong. One of the hoses, which had been secured earlier, was now loose. He frowned, checking the fittings, but it was clear that someone had intentionally tampered with it. "This wasn't like this before," he muttered under his breath. "Someone's been messing with the vehicle." Julie turned to Emily, her eyes wide. "We've been sabotaged." Emily was already looking around, scanning the room for any sign of someone else. "It's just us, right? No one's come back inside." But they all knew. They had no choice but to trust each other. Julie crouched down to inspect the damage. There was a part of her that wanted to ignore it, to believe it was just a mistake, but deep down, she knew it wasn't. The entity had already shown how far it was willing to go. It was manipulating them, feeding off their desperation, their exhaustion. They weren't just fighting against the storm or the mimics. They were fighting something far more insidious. Julie's stomach twisted as she realized that they had been set up. The entity wasn't just trying to trap them physically, it was trying to break their spirit. As they worked on repairing the sabotage, a dark realization began to settle in. Julie's brother, Daniel, had been part of a group of recruits that had come to Berkner Station years ago. Julie had learned that Daniel had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, just like all the others who had come before them. "They were never meant to leave, were they?" Julie asked, the words barely above a whisper as she stood beside the vehicle. She looked at Jack, her eyes filled with a terrible understanding. Jack sighed, wiping his brow with his sleeve. No, they were part of a test. Just like us, we weren't meant to survive. Berkner Station was never about research. It was about testing human limits, pushing people to the brink of madness. Julie's mind raced, but there was nothing she could do to stop the flood of memories. Her brother had been manipulated too. Daniel had known. He had probably seen the same things they were seeing now: the voices, the mimics, the strange behavior of the maintenance crew. He had been part of this, just like they were now. The truth was too overwhelming to process. Berkner Station wasn't a research outpost. It was a psychological experiment. They had been chosen to come here, selected for the experiment that tested their ability to survive under extreme isolation. But what they didn't know, what Daniel hadn't known, was that they were never meant to leave. Julie's breath quickened, and she felt a rising panic in her chest. "It's all been a lie, hasn't it?" Jack nodded grimly. "They chose us. They chose your brother, Julie." The entity fed on their minds, their memories, and their resilience. It used them to fuel its own power, and now we're just another set of recruits waiting to be consumed. Julie's hands shook as she rummaged through the station's old computer systems in the maintenance room. She was looking for answers, for anything that might explain what was really happening. She had to know the truth. She had to understand what had been hidden from them. Finally, after hours of sifting through corrupted files and outdated records, she found it, the original research files on the entity. The files had been heavily redacted, but what remained was enough to paint a chilling picture. Julie's eyes widened as she read the documents aloud, her voice trembling with disbelief. "It's all here. The station, the entity, the recruitment process. It's all part of a psychological experiment, one designed to test human resilience in extreme isolation. They selected recruits from various backgrounds and placed them in Berkner Station to see how they would respond to the entity's influence." Emily and Jack gathered around her, their faces pale as the implications sank in. Julie continued reading. "The entity isn't just some biological anomaly. It's a parasitic intelligence that feeds on human memories and emotions. It adapts, it mimics." She paused, her eyes scanning the screen. "It copies everything we are, and it uses those memories to replace us, one by one." The gravity of the situation was impossible to ignore. Berkner Station wasn't just some isolated outpost, it was a trap. The recruits had been chosen to feed the entity, to become part of its endless cycle. And now, they were just another set of memories for it to feed on. As the hours dragged on and the storm raged outside, something began to change. The station seemed to take on a life of its own, responding to their presence in a way that felt unnatural. The walls felt alive, as though they were watching them, listening to their conversations. The air felt thick, heavy, like the station was breathing in time with them. The strange mimicry had become more invasive, seeping into their very thoughts, reminding them of their pasts, showing them things they couldn't explain. They began to feel like they were being watched, not just by the entity, but by the very walls of Berkner Station. The entity had learned, adapting to the new recruits, using their memories and emotions to lure them in further. "It's like it knows us," Julie whispered, her breath shallow. "It knows everything about us." Jack stood motionless, his face tense. "It's been watching us, learning from us. The station, the entity, it's all part of the same thing. The more we fight, the more it feeds off of us, the more it becomes us." Julie looked around, her mind racing. The station was no longer just a building. It was a part of the entity now. It had learned from them. It had taken what it needed. And it wasn't going to stop until they were all gone. The storm outside raged like an ancient creature, relentless and unforgiving. But inside Berkner Station, the true horror wasn't the cold or the wind, it was the entity. It had gotten inside their heads. It wasn't just mimicking their voices or memories anymore. It was attacking them on a deeper, more insidious level. Every waking hour felt like a battle for their minds. It was as if the very walls of the station were closing in on them, suffocating their thoughts, twisting their identities. The survivors, Julie, Jack, Emily, had been driven to the edge of their sanity. The entity had long since fed on their fears, but now it was directly assaulting their very sense of self. It was pulling at their memories, twisting their thoughts, and using their deepest regrets and insecurities against them. The deeper they got into the station, the more they realized that there was no way out, no safe place, no escape. Their minds were breaking down. They were losing themselves. Every night, Julie would wake to the sound of voices, and every time the voices were more real, more personal. At first, she had heard Daniel's voice calling her name, but now it wasn't just his voice. It was the voices of everyone she had ever lost, her parents, her childhood friends, people she had loved and lost. They all whispered to her from the darkness, promising to help her, to guide her. But Julie knew better now. She knew it wasn't them. It was the entity manipulating her mind, twisting her memories. "Julie, come closer, I need you." The voice was sweet, familiar. It was Daniel, her brother's voice. She could almost feel him next to her, the warmth of his presence, the comfort of knowing he was there. But then the familiar warmth turned to coldness. She blinked, and in that brief moment, the entity showed her the truth. It wasn't Daniel. It was a mimic. A distorted version of her brother, a creature that had learned her deepest fear and regret, her brother's death. Julie clutched her head, trying to shake off the vision. It had been too real, too close. The memories of Daniel, of her past, had always been her anchor, but now they were a weapon that the entity could use against her, turning her memories into nightmares. "You're not real, Daniel," Julie whispered, her voice trembling. But even as she said the words, she wasn't sure if she believed them anymore. She was becoming unhinged. The entity had found her weakness, and now it was pushing her to the edge. The others weren't faring much better. Jack had always been the calm one, the one who held the group together. But lately, his eyes had begun to hollow out, his gaze distant. He had begun to withdraw, his mind clearly torn between the need to survive and the fear of what the entity could do to them. It was as though the walls of Berkner Station were closing in on him, and he couldn't escape. One night, Jack sat alone in the common room, staring at the walls as though he was looking for something that wasn't there. He muttered to himself, his voice low, almost incoherent. "No one ever gets out." He repeated the words like a chant. "It never ends, we never leave." Emily, who had been watching him from the doorway, took a step forward. "Jack!" He didn't respond. Emily walked closer, unsure of what to do. The paranoia was taking its toll on everyone, but Jack was disintegrating faster than the others. His resolve had always been his strength, but now it was his weakness. He was the leader, but he was losing his grip. "Jack, you need to pull yourself together," Emily said, her voice firm. "We can still escape. We can still get to the outpost. We just need to stay focused." Jack looked up at her, his eyes wild with fear. "You don't understand. We're all already gone. You saw what happened to Lucas. You saw what happened to Sarah. The entity doesn't just kill us. It turns us into it. We don't have a chance. We're already lost." His voice cracked, the realization sinking in. The despair was settling in like an illness. Julie had seen it happen before. The entity had poisoned their minds, and now Jack had become a victim of it. "We need to keep fighting." Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "We can't let it win." But even as she said the words, Emily felt the weight of them. Could they really keep fighting? Was there anything left to fight for? As if the emotional toll wasn't enough, the entity began to show itself in ways the recruits could no longer ignore. It wasn't just memories and voices anymore. It was manifesting physically, shifting forms, twisting the survivors into grotesque versions of themselves. One evening, as Julie walked through the hallways of Berkner Station, she caught a glimpse of a figure in the reflection of a window. It was her, but it wasn't. The face staring back at her was distorted, the skin stretched too tight, the eyes hollow and dark. She turned quickly, her heart pounding, but the figure was gone. "What is happening?" Julie breathed, her voice barely above a whisper. It was no longer just the voices, the memories. The entity was becoming them, taking their identities and turning them into something else, something unnatural. Jack and Emily had seen it too. The station had become a funhouse, a warped reflection of their own worst fears. There were whispers in the dark corners of the station, shadows that moved when no one was looking, and eyes that watched them when they turned away. One night, Emily found herself alone in the kitchen, her back to the door. She reached for the coffee pot, but when she turned around, she saw her reflection in the window. But it wasn't her. It was a distorted version. Her eyes were too wide, the skin on her face too tight. She gasped, dropping the coffee pot, but when she blinked, the reflection returned to normal. "Get out of my head," Emily whispered, gripping the counter tightly. But the entity wouldn't stop. It would never stop. The mental strain was wearing them down. Their bodies were exhausted from lack of food, from the constant tension of being watched, of being hunted. The storm outside was relentless, and they were trapped. But even though they were barely able to keep their eyes open, they couldn't stop moving. They couldn't stop fighting. "We can't just sit here and die," Julie said, her voice hoarse. "We have to keep going." But even as she said the words, she felt the truth sinking in. They couldn't escape. There was no escape from the entity. They were already lost. Jack, Emily, and Julie had been isolated for so long that it was impossible to tell what was real anymore. They had been broken down, their identities stolen, their minds twisted into something unrecognizable. They had fought for so long, but now all they had left was desperation. The storm outside had reached a fever pitch, howling through the station with an intensity that made it seem as though the very earth had risen up against them. The wind screamed, rattling the walls, and the snow piled up against the windows like an immovable force, locking them inside. Yet, despite the growing sense of hopelessness, there was something far more insidious than the storm itself creeping into the hearts and minds of the survivors. For Julie, Jack, Emily, and Hayden, the final rule, never go outside after dark, had always been a sacred truth, something they had clung to with the fervor of people desperate for survival. But now, as the darkness closed in on them and the storm raged outside, the survivors' mental states had begun to fracture. It was Hayden who, for the first time, found herself standing by the northern door, the one that had always been locked and guarded. Her breath came in short gasps, and her hands shook as they gripped the handle. The rule that had been drilled into them for days, "Don't go outside," was now a distant memory. It had become meaningless, a mere relic of a past they no longer trusted. The entity had already claimed them in ways they could never have imagined. "I have to know," Hayden whispered, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. She had heard it again, the voice that had been calling her name, just like it had for Julie, Emily, and the others. But this time it was different. It wasn't just a whisper. It was clear, unmistakable, a voice from her past. A voice that made her feel like she wasn't alone anymore. It sounded like someone she knew, like someone who had been part of her life before everything started to fall apart. Her mother. "Hayden, help me, please." The temptation was too strong to ignore. She had spent days fighting the urges to give in to the voices, to ignore the whispers, but now, something inside her snapped. The entity had already taken so much from her, twisted her memories, played with her emotions. It was time to face whatever was out there. She turned the handle, her heart pounding as the door creaked open, letting in the bitter cold and the overwhelming force of the wind. But Hayden didn't hesitate. She stepped out into the snowstorm, the darkness swallowing her whole as she trudged into the void. The moment Hayden stepped beyond the threshold of the station, the world around her shifted. The blinding white of the snowstorm faded, and she found herself standing in an alien landscape. The station was nowhere to be seen, its lights lost in the tempest. The snow had stopped falling, replaced by a creeping stillness, like the world itself was holding its breath. And there, in the distance, she saw them, figures. Shapes moving through the snow, their movements erratic and jerky, like creatures caught in a nightmarish dance. Her heart skipped a beat as the realization hit her. They weren't people. They were twisted versions of the people she had known. The survivors, the researchers, even the original personnel who had been sent to Berkner Station. But these weren't the people she had worked with, the people she had laughed and cried with. These were distorted mimics, grotesque imitations of the human beings they once were, their faces stretched and deformed into expressions of horror. Hayden's breath caught in her throat. She tried to turn back to escape, but something kept her rooted to the spot. The figures moved closer, their forms more familiar with every passing second, yet utterly wrong. She recognized Julie, her face contorted into a grotesque mask, staring at her with eyes that were empty. She saw Jack, his movements stiff and mechanical, his face like a broken doll. And in the distance, a figure she couldn't quite make out, Emily, her body jerking unnaturally, her limbs twisted. "Hayden, come closer." The voice whispered again, now distorted and layered with others. Julie's, Jack's, Emily's, and even those of the past recruits who had come before them. They were all calling her, but there was no warmth, no love. There was only coldness and an overwhelming sense of dread. Hayden wanted to scream, to run back into the station, but her legs refused to move. The figures closed in on her, and she realized, with a chill running down her spine, that she had just stepped into a trap. The voices, the memories, the warmth, it had all been part of the entity's manipulation. It had led her here to the edge of madness where nothing was real. The figures began to circle her, their faces contorting into horrific shapes, their bodies bending in ways that defied nature. Their eyes, wide and blank, followed her every movement, and then, as if on cue, they spoke together. "We are not you." The cold truth hit her all at once. The entity wasn't just consuming their bodies. It was rewriting them, erasing who they were and replacing them with perfect copies. It wasn't just trying to kill them, it was trying to take them completely. The entity was consuming their souls, their identities, turning them into empty vessels that it could mimic and control. Hayden's mind spiraled. She realized that this had been happening all along. The disappearances, the distortions, the creatures outside, they were all part of the entity's cycle. It had been feeding off them, using their memories, their emotions, and turning them into copies. Each new batch of recruits was a new set of victims, and each set fed the entity's power. They weren't meant to escape, they were meant to become part of it. And the worst part? There was no escape. The entity had already claimed them all. They were already lost, their identities rewritten, their memories erased. Hayden could feel the cold fingers of the entity tightening around her mind. She was no longer herself. She was becoming just another mimic, just another piece in the entity's game. As the figures closed in on her, Hayden fell to her knees, her body shaking uncontrollably. She fought to hold on to who she was, to remember what it felt like to be human, to feel love, to feel alive. But all of it was slipping away, replaced by a horrible emptiness. "We are not you, Hayden." The voice said again, this time with more authority. Back inside Berkner Station, Julie, Jack, and Emily waited in silent dread. They had been watching through the station's windows, unable to see Hayden outside, but feeling her presence fade. They had heard her call their names, heard the distorted whispers in the air, but now it was clear. Hayden was gone. Julie's heart twisted in her chest. They had lost another one. The storm outside had never been as menacing as the truth that had finally revealed itself. The entity wasn't just a creature. It was a parasitic force, consuming their very essence, rewriting them into something that wasn't human. It had learned to feed on memories, on identity. And now, there was only one way forward: confront it. "We can't let it take any more of us." Julie said, her voice determined, though her hands trembled as she reached for the weapon they had hoped they wouldn't need. It was time to end it or die trying. But as they began to prepare themselves for the final confrontation, the station shook violently. The lights flickered, and the walls seemed to groan, as if the entire structure was alive, responding to their presence. The entity was closing in, no longer content with merely manipulating them. It was ready to consume them entirely. "We're running out of time," Jack said, his voice steely. "We need to face it head-on." Julie, Jack, and Emily moved towards the main hallway, their minds focused. They would confront the entity, even if it meant their lives. But they knew deep down that this wasn't just about surviving. It was about defeating the thing that had been consuming them, piece by piece, for so long. But as they approached the central control room, they heard something that stopped them cold. A voice. "You can't win." It wasn't their own voices anymore. It was the entity in its purest form, its true nature, capable of manipulating reality itself, of absorbing consciousness and turning it into its own. Julie stepped forward, her face determined. "We're not afraid of you anymore." The storm outside had grown into a monstrous force, tearing at the very fabric of Berkner Station. The wind howled like a ravenous beast, the snow whipped through the air, and the darkness seemed to stretch on forever. But inside, the survivors were no longer hiding in fear. They were preparing for the end. They had one final chance to escape the entity's grip and put an end to the horror they had been living for months. Julie, Jack, and Emily stood huddled together in the control room, the flickering lights casting ominous shadows around them. The room was filled with the faint hum of machinery, but it sounded hollow, like the heartbeat of a station that was slowly dying. Outside, the storm raged with a terrifying intensity, but they knew the storm was nothing compared to what was coming. "We can't wait any longer," Jack said, his voice low and determined. His eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep, but his mind was sharper than ever. He had become the anchor for the group, the one who refused to lose hope, even when it seemed impossible. "If we don't act now, we'll never get another chance." Julie nodded grimly. "We destroy the power systems. We cut off the entity's connection to the station. That's our only shot." They had spent hours discussing their options, analyzing the schematics of the station, and mapping out a plan. The entity had taken control of the power systems, using them to manipulate the station's environment and their minds. If they could disable the power, they might have a chance at crippling the entity or at least stopping it from manipulating their every move. "But there's a risk," Emily said, her voice strained. "The self-destruct system is built into the power grid. If we overload it, it could destroy the entire station." "We don't have a choice," Jack replied, his expression steely. "Either we destroy it now, or we let it destroy us." The group was silent for a moment, the weight of the decision pressing down on them. They had come so far, faced so many horrors, and now it all came down to this one final act of defiance. Would they win, or would they become just another set of mimics the entity added to its collection? Julie's thoughts were a whirlwind of fear and determination. The entity had already stolen so much from them: memories, identities, even their sense of reality. But if they succeeded, if they destroyed the station's power systems, they might be able to end it once and for all. "Let's do it," Julie said, her voice steady despite the fear gripping her heart. The survivors gathered their tools and moved toward the main power systems, a final stand against the malevolent force that had haunted them for so long. As they made their way to the power room, the tension was palpable. The entity's influence still lingered in the walls, its presence pressing in on them like a living thing. They had no idea what they would face in the power room, but they knew they had to act fast before it was too late. When they reached the heart of the station's power systems, Jack hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the control panel. "We've been living in a lie," he said, his voice breaking the silence. Everything we've known about this place, about Berkner Station, has been a deception. Julie looked at him, confused. What do you mean? The entity, Jack continued, his face grim. It's not just some creature beneath the ice. It's been here for millennia. This station, these experiments, they were never about science or research. They were about containment. Julie's heart sank. Containment? Jack nodded. The entity has been feeding on those who venture too close, luring them with promises of immortality, but in the end it consumes them, body and soul. It rewrites their memories, their identities. And each time someone disappears, it learns from them, adapting to become more like them. It's not just a parasite. It's an evolving force that feeds on human identity. Julie's mind spun as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. They hadn't been chosen for research. They had been chosen to feed the entity. And the worst part? The original researchers, the first crew to arrive at Berkner Station, had fallen into the same trap. They had been consumed, replaced by perfect copies. The entity had been evolving for centuries, feeding off every soul it absorbed, growing stronger and more insidious with each passing year. "We were never meant to leave," Jack whispered, his voice heavy with regret. "None of us were." Just as they began to activate the power systems, the doors behind them burst open and a figure stepped into the room. It was Hayden, but something was off. Her eyes were blank, her movements slow and deliberate. She smiled, a false, cold smile. "You really think you can destroy it?" Julie's heart raced. "Hayden, what's happened to you?" Hayden didn't answer. Instead, she stepped forward, her movements unnaturally precise. "I understand now. You don't get it. The entity has shown me the truth. Immortality, power, freedom from the chains of humanity. Don't you see? We don't have to fight it. We can become part of it." The others stepped back, but Hayden continued, her voice growing more intense. "The entity is the future. The only way we can escape this endless cycle is by joining it, becoming one with it." Julie took a step forward, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and anger. "You're lying. This isn't freedom, it's destruction." But Hayden's face twisted into something strange, her smile too wide, her eyes too cold. "You don't understand. You're just like the others. You think you're saving yourselves, but you're too late. The entity is already inside you." Julie took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I won't let it take us." In that moment, Julie realized that Hayden had already been consumed. She wasn't Hayden anymore. She was just another mimic, a perfect copy created by the entity to keep them from their goal. Suddenly, Hayden lunged at them, but Jack was faster. He pulled the emergency release lever, disconnecting the power grid from the station. As the lights flickered, Hayden screamed, her voice warping into something monstrous. Jack grabbed the detonator, activating the self-destruct system in the station. But before he could finish the activation, Hayden lunged, knocking him to the ground. "You can't destroy it. You'll never escape. You belong to it now." With the self-destruct countdown flashing on the screen, Jack knew that there was no time left. He was already too close to the entity, too close to the darkness that had consumed them all. But he couldn't let it win. He couldn't let the entity live to consume another group of recruits. "I'll make sure it ends here," Jack said, looking into Julie's eyes. He knew the gravity of what he was about to do. He wasn't going to make it out alive. He was going to sacrifice himself, and in doing so, he would ensure that the entity would never escape. With one final press of the button, Jack triggered the self-destruct sequence. The lights flickered, and the ground shook as the power systems began to overload. The entity screamed, its presence flashing across the room in a flash of blinding light. But Jack didn't flinch. He had already made peace with the sacrifice. "Goodbye, Julie." His last words were soft but filled with resolve. And then, with a deafening boom, the station exploded. The chaos of the explosion reverberated through every inch of Berkner Station. Flames engulfed the walls, their orange glow casting eerie shadows that danced wildly. The tremors shook the station, as if the earth itself was protesting the destruction of such a malevolent force. Yet, in the heart of the madness, amidst the crumbling walls, Jack Foster's mind remained clear, resolute. In the seconds before everything would be consumed by the explosion, Jack stumbled toward the radio console. Hayden's scream echoed in the distance, but Jack couldn't focus on it. There was no time left. He had to ensure that the truth about Berkner Station was sent out into the world. He had to give the survivors, the future, a warning. With shaky hands, he began to tap into the radio system, his heart pounding. The station's power grid was failing fast, the system spiraling toward a final shutdown. The self-destruct countdown was ticking in the background, a cold reminder of the irreversible decision he had made. His fingers flew across the keyboard, trying to send a message, anything that could warn those who might come after them. If he could just reach one more person, if the message could get out, then maybe, just maybe, the entity would be prevented from consuming another group of innocent souls. This is Jack Foster, Berkner Station. If anyone is listening, do not come here. Do not, under any circumstances, come to Berkner Station. His voice was steady, though his body was shaking with the strain of the seconds slipping away. The cold, harsh reality of the situation loomed, but Jack's words were filled with purpose. We were never meant to leave. This station, this thing beneath the ice it consumes, it feeds on us, on our memories, on our identities. It rewrites us. Please, do not let curiosity take you to places where you can't control what you find. Stay away. Stay away from Berkner Station. The radio crackled. The last moments of connection felt like a small thread of hope in the overwhelming darkness. But as Jack pressed the final button, the transmission was swallowed by static. His heart beat faster. Would anyone hear it? Would anyone be able to save the next generation? Jack closed his eyes for a moment, letting the stillness take over him. The message had been sent. The station's final words would reverberate into the unknown, hopefully carried on the wind to those brave enough to heed them. As the explosion detonated, the walls of Berkner Station crumbled. The force of the blast felt like an entire world falling apart, the ground beneath Jack's feet shuddering in one last gasp before everything was consumed by the inferno. The flames roared, tearing through the corridors and ripping apart what was once their home. In the midst of it all, Jack's mind cleared. For the first time in what seemed like forever, he felt a strange peace settle over him. The weight of fear, of constant paranoia, of the fear of becoming something he wasn't, it was all gone. His final thoughts were not of terror, but of relief. He had done what he could. He had sacrificed himself, knowing that he could never escape the station, but perhaps the message he sent would save others. Maybe, just maybe, the entity had been destroyed with the explosion. He had broken the cycle, not for himself, but for the future, for those who would never set foot in Berkner Station. In his final moments, Jack's thoughts drifted not to the entity, but to freedom, to the people who might now be safe, never knowing the horrors he had witnessed. He hoped that they would never have to face what he had. And then, as the explosion intensified, the light engulfed him. For a moment, there was nothing but brilliant white, and then the silence. The station was gone. The cycle of destruction had ended. When the storm had calmed and the storm clouds began to dissipate, the aftermath of the explosion was laid bare. The remains of Berkner Station were now just a charred husk, a testament to the darkness that had once resided beneath its walls. Smoke billowed into the sky, thick and dark, mingling with the remnants of the storm. The wind howled as if mourning the loss of what had been, what could have been. The survivors, those who had not succumbed to the entity, were gone. Julie, Emily, and a few others had perished in the blast. Their bodies were recovered and laid to rest, their names now etched in the annals of history, a grim reminder of the price they paid for knowledge, for curiosity. Yet, even as their bodies were brought to the surface, a new story began to unfold. Berkner Station was destroyed, but the entity, had it truly been eradicated, or had it simply moved on to a new victim, a new set of recruits? As the bodies of the survivors were cataloged and sent back to the outside world, a new team began to make its way to Berkner Station. The place that had once been a site of scientific research was now being investigated as part of the larger Antarctic exploration effort. But what they didn't know, what they could never know, was that the entity had survived. It was a parasite, a force that could not be easily eradicated. Its influence would stretch beyond the icy depths of Berkner Station, and those who came next would walk the same path. The station's skeleton still stood, frozen in time, waiting for the next team to arrive, and somewhere beneath the ice, buried deep, the entity was waiting. The final words came through the static on a new set of researchers' radios. They were innocent, unaware of what lay before them. They couldn't know what had happened before, could they? How could they? The history of the station was buried under layers of cold and secrecy, lost to time and manipulation. But the entity had survived. It would always survive. The last line echoed into the silence of the icy tundra. It was a line that would follow these new researchers, that would haunt them just as it had haunted the survivors before. It was a line that, perhaps, they could never escape. "Welcome to Berkner Station." And then the static cut off.